Charles Manson spent most of his life in prison before he ever became famous. By the time he walked out of Terminal Island Federal Correctional Institution in March 1967, at the age of 32, he had spent more than half his entire life behind bars. For car theft, forgery, pimping, and a string of other offenses that painted the picture of a man who had never once lived a straight life. He reportedly begged prison officials to let him stay. The world outside, he said, frightened him. They released him anyway. What happened next is one of the most studied and still most poorly understood chapters in American criminal history. Manson arrived in San Francisco at the precise moment that the city had become the center of the counterculture movement. Young people were flooding into Haight-Ashbury from all over the country. Runaways, dropouts, idealists, people fleeing abusive families and small towns that had never understood them. They were searching for something: community, meaning, love. Manson understood this instinctively, the way a predator understands the movements of prey. He positioned himself as a guru, a teacher, a man who had seen through the illusions of society. He played guitar. He talked about love and freedom and the end of the old world, and one by one, young women began to follow him. The group that would become known as the Manson family formed gradually through 1967 and 1968. Accumulating members as Manson traveled up and down California in a converted school bus. The core of the group was almost entirely young women, many of them teenagers, most of them from broken or troubled backgrounds. Manson selected them carefully, not for their strength, but for their vulnerability, their eagerness to be loved, their willingness to believe that this strange, intense man with the magnetic eyes had answers that the rest of the world did not. He told them they were special. He told them society had lied to them their whole lives. He told them that only here, only with him, could they find the truth. The group eventually settled at Spahn Ranch, a dilapidated movie ranch in the hills northwest of Los Angeles that had once been used for Western film productions. The ranch's elderly, nearly blind owner, George Spahn, allowed them to stay in exchange for labor and companionship. The young women in Manson's group took turns keeping him company. At the ranch, Manson tightened his control. He controlled what people ate, when they slept, who they slept with. He used LSD extensively, not recreationally, but as a tool, dosing followers during long group sessions designed to break down individual identity and rebuild it around loyalty to him. He preached an apocalyptic vision he called Helter Skelter, a coming race war between black and white Americans that would destroy society, after which Manson and his family would emerge from underground to rule what remained. It was incoherent. It was grandiose. His followers believed every word of it. By the summer of 1969, Manson's vision had curdled into something that required blood. He believed that Helter Skelter was not coming fast enough on its own, and that the family needed to trigger it, to commit murders so brutal and so racially charged that they would ignite the war he had been predicting. On the night of August 8, 1969, he sent 4 of his followers to 150 Salo Drive in Benedict Canyon, a house he had previously visited and which was now rented by film director Roman Polanski and his wife, actress Sharon Tate. Tate was 8.5 months pregnant. She and 4 friends were inside when Manson's followers arrived. All 5 were murdered. The word pig was written on the front door in Sharon Tate's blood. The following night, Manson himself led a group to the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca in the Los Feliz neighborhood. The LaBiancas were tied up and then killed. The words Helter Skelter were written on the refrigerator in their blood. War was carved into Leno LaBianca's stomach. The murders sent Los Angeles into a panic unlike anything the city had experienced. Nobody knew who was responsible. Nobody knew if it would happen again. The police had no leads for months. It was only through a combination of luck, informants, and a jailed family member talking too freely that investigators eventually connected Manson and his followers to the killings. Manson was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy in 1971, despite not personally killing any of the victims. The prosecution argued successfully that he had directed and orchestrated everything. He died in prison in November 2017, at the age of 83, having never expressed genuine remorse for any of it. What makes Charles Manson worth studying, not celebrating, studying, is not the murders themselves but the mechanism. How does a man with no money, no institutional power, no weapons, and a fifth-grade education convince a group of people to commit murder for him without even being present? The answer, documented exhaustively by investigators and psychologists over 50 years, is that he didn't do it through force. He did it through the slow, methodical destruction of each follower's individual sense of self, replacing it with a collective identity entirely dependent on him. By the time the murders happened, the people who committed them did not experience themselves as acting independently. They experienced themselves as extensions of Manson's will. That is what makes this case so enduring and so instructive. The murders were committed by ordinary people. Manson just built the machine that made them capable of it. Manson used violence, drugs, and apocalyptic prophecy to destroy his followers' sense of self. The next leader we're covering used something far more modern and far more insidious: wellness culture, sexual liberation, and Silicon Valley money to do almost exactly the same thing. Nicole Daedone founded OneTaste in San Francisco in 2004 with a concept she called orgasmic meditation, a 15-minute practice she described as a form of mindfulness, involving a specific physical act performed by a partner on a woman with the stated purpose of achieving deeper emotional and physical awareness. She positioned it not as something sexual, but as something scientific, a wellness practice, a meditation technique, a tool for personal growth. She was articulate, charismatic, and extraordinarily skilled at making the deeply strange sound entirely reasonable. And in the early adopter culture of San Francisco, where the line between wellness innovation and outright absurdity was always somewhat blurry, she found an audience. The company grew rapidly. OneTaste opened centers, sold courses, hosted public events, and built a community of thousands of members across the United States. Courses started at $10,000 and went up from there. The most committed members were invited to live communally at what the company called the warehouse, a converted building in San Francisco where up to 50 people lived in open dormitory conditions, sleeping in rows of twin IKEA beds, separated by thin sheer curtains with no private bathrooms, no personal space, and almost no boundaries of any kind. Members who lived there woke at 7 in the morning for mandatory group sessions. They wrote daily fear inventories, lists of their deepest anxieties and insecurities, and shared them with partners. They made sales calls for hours each day. They attended evening public sessions. They were told that any discomfort they felt was not a sign that something was wrong. It was a sign they were growing. The recruitment pipeline for OneTaste was sophisticated and deliberately engineered. Street teams set up coffee booths in busy areas of San Francisco, handing out free drinks and opening conversations with deliberately provocative questions designed to create intrigue and a sense of fate, as if the encounter was somehow meant to happen. Prospective members were brought to free events where they were subjected to what the company called hot seats, 30-minute public interviews in which a skilled facilitator would ask increasingly personal questions, drawing out fears, desires, insecurities, and regrets, while a sales team in the back of the room typed every detail into laptops for later use. The most vulnerable people were targeted specifically. Death meditations were held in which attendees lay on the floor, closed their eyes, and were instructed to think about dying, what they regretted, what they had never done, who they wished they had forgiven. The answers were noted. The follow-up calls were tailored precisely to those answers. Inside the organization, members were taught that the company ran on two currencies, money and orgasm. Rachel, the head of sales and Nicole's closest deputy, trained a team she internally called fluffers, young, attractive female members instructed to wear short skirts and generate what the company described as erotic energy in potential clients, making them feel a sense of possibility and connection that would make them more likely to spend money. The official line was that this was a form of energetic transmission, that these women had such powerful personal energy that it could be directed at others like a tool. The unofficial line, shared openly in internal meetings, was simpler: get them excited enough that they want to come back and pay for more. Life inside the warehouse was designed to eliminate privacy completely. Members had no personal space beyond a small locker. Bathrooms had no stalls. The main sleeping area held 30 people in 15 beds, close enough to hear and often see everything happening around them. Intimate activity between members was common and visible. Members were encouraged to observe rather than look away. Voyeurism was framed as a form of openness and growth. Any discomfort with this was itself reframed as evidence of personal limitation that needed to be worked through. The language was always therapeutic. The experience for many was something else entirely. Nicole cultivated relationships with wealthy Silicon Valley investors, most notably a tech entrepreneur named Reese Jones, who invested over $1 million in the company. To keep him invested, financially and emotionally, Nicole directed female members of the organization to spend time with him, provide him with intimate services, and eventually sent 2 women to live with him full-time as what the company called handlers. Critically, both of the women selected were queer. Women who were not attracted to men and had made that clear. OneTaste's internal teaching was that discomfort with partners outside your orientation was simply a limitation to be overcome through practice. Former members have described being told that sleeping with investors was not exploitation. It was a spiritual opportunity. It was an honor. OneTaste, they were told, ran on these exchanges. To refuse was to hold back the mission. The investigation into OneTaste began after a Bloomberg journalist named Alan Wheat published a devastating investigative piece in 2018, detailing allegations from dozens of former members, financial exploitation, sexual coercion, forced labor, and psychological manipulation on a systematic scale. Shortly afterward, the FBI opened an investigation. For nearly 3 years, nothing was publicly announced. Then, in June 2023, 10 black SUVs pulled up outside. 20 federal agents got out. A helicopter circled above. Nicole Daedone and Rachel were arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit forced labor. The trial began in May 2025. Former members testified in detail about being pressured into sexual acts with investors, being coerced into intimate situations they had explicitly not consented to, being financially drained through high-pressure sales techniques that targeted their most vulnerable moments, and being psychologically manipulated through sleep deprivation, sexual overstimulation, and the systematic dismantling of their personal boundaries. Nicole's legal team argued that everything at OneTaste had been chosen freely, that the presence of text messages saying "I love you" to Nicole proved that no coercion had occurred. The jury disagreed. Both Nicole and Rachel were found guilty of conspiracy to commit forced labor. They face up to 20 years in federal prison. As of now, sentencing has not yet been delivered. Nicole has not expressed remorse. From jail, an AI-generated video of her was posted to social media, showing a digitally created version of herself speaking from what appeared to be her prison bunk, describing her incarceration as a revolution and herself as a woman who had been persecuted for having too much power. The real Nicole Daedone, sitting in a cell at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, has still not explained why she did any of it. Nicole Daedone built her cult in plain sight, inside a city, inside wellness culture, collecting millions of dollars while systematically destroying the people who trusted her. The last leader tonight worked differently. He used God. He used Scripture, and he used a compound in the Texas desert to make sure nobody could leave. David Koresh was born Vernon Wayne Howell in Houston, Texas in 1959. He was dyslexic and struggled in school, dropping out in 9th grade. But he memorized large sections of the Bible by the time he was a teenager and developed an extraordinary ability to speak about Scripture for hours in a way that felt, to certain listeners, like genuine revelation. The sense that this man understood something that other preachers did not, that he had access to a layer of meaning hidden beneath the surface of the text. He joined the Branch Davidians, a small religious sect based at a compound called Mount Carmel Center outside Waco, Texas in the early 1980s. Through a combination of biblical argumentation, personal charisma, and a ruthless willingness to eliminate internal opposition, he had taken complete control of the group by 1987. He renamed himself David Koresh. David, after the biblical king, Koresh after the Hebrew name of Cyrus the Great. He was declaring in his own name that he was a king and a conqueror, Koresh taught his followers that he was the final prophet, the one who would open the 7 seals described in the book of Revelation and usher in the end of the world. He told them that Scripture had given him specific authority over the women in the group, that it was not only his right but his divine obligation to take multiple wives, including the wives and daughters of other male members. He referred to these arrangements as spiritual marriages. Several of his so-called wives were minors. The male members of the group were told their own marriages were spiritually annulled. Their wives now belonged to Koresh. Former members who eventually left described a process of total submission in which Koresh gradually redefined every aspect of their lives: their diet, their sleep schedules, their sexual relationships, their understanding of reality, until the world outside the compound seemed not just foreign but hostile, and Koresh himself seemed like the only source of safety and truth. Life at Mount Carmel was physically harsh and psychologically total. Members worked long hours, ate restricted diets, and slept little. Koresh's teaching sessions could last for 12 hours or more, marathon Bible studies in which he would hold forth on his interpretations of Revelation, challenging anyone who disagreed, wearing down resistance through sheer endurance. He controlled who could leave the property and when. He monitored relationships between members. He controlled the flow of information from outside. Members who questioned his authority were subjected to public humiliation and spiritual condemnation, told that their doubt was not just personally dangerous, but a sign of spiritual failure that threatened everyone around them. The compound also had a significant stockpile of weapons, legally purchased firearms that Koresh had been accumulating for years, some of which the group was converting into illegal automatic weapons as part of what members described as preparation for the coming apocalyptic confrontation with the outside world. It was this weapons cache that first drew the attention of federal authorities. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives began investigating the group in 1992. By early 1993, they had obtained a search warrant and an arrest warrant for Koresh on federal firearms charges. On February 28, 1993, ATF agents attempted to raid Mount Carmel and serve the warrants. Someone inside the compound had been tipped off. The element of surprise was gone before agents even arrived. When they approached, gunfire erupted from within the buildings. 4 ATF agents were killed. 16 were wounded. 6 Branch Davidians also died in the initial exchange. The raid had failed catastrophically, and what followed was one of the longest and most scrutinized law enforcement standoffs in American history. For 51 days, FBI negotiators attempted to convince Koresh to surrender peacefully and allow the children inside the compound to leave. Koresh negotiated constantly, agreed to terms repeatedly, and then changed his position, citing new biblical revelations that required him to wait. Children were released in small numbers in the early days of the standoff. A total of 21 children eventually came out, but the majority of the group remained inside. Koresh gave lengthy Bible study sessions over the phone to negotiators. He recorded a religious message that he said he needed to send to the world before he would surrender. FBI agents waited. Attorney General Janet Reno, under pressure from reports of children still inside and the cost of maintaining the standoff, approved a plan to insert tear gas into the compound and force an evacuation on April 19, 1993. What happened next has been disputed ever since. Shortly after the tear gas insertion began, fire broke out simultaneously in multiple locations inside the compound. FBI officials maintained that Koresh's followers had started the fires themselves, that this was a mass suicide, a phony act of apocalyptic theater choreographed by Koresh. Survivors and some investigators have suggested that the fires may have been started by the tear gas insertion equipment or by a combination of factors involving both the FBI operation and actions taken by those inside. What is not disputed is the outcome. The fire moved through the wooden compound with extraordinary speed. 76 people died, including 25 children. David Koresh was found dead from a gunshot wound to the head, shot either by one of his own followers or by his own hand as the fire closed in around him. The Waco siege has never stopped generating controversy. Congressional hearings were held. Independent investigations were commissioned. Films and documentaries have revisited the events from every possible angle for 30 years. What most analysts agree on is that the decisions made on both sides. Koresh's refusal to surrender, The FBI's decision to insert tear gas into a compound full of children contributed to an outcome that killed more than 7 dozen people, most of whom had committed no crime beyond choosing to follow a man who told them he was the voice of God. David Koresh was 33 years old when he died. He had spent the last decade of his life building a world in which he was the center of everything, and when that world burned, it took everyone inside it with him. Subscribe for more. New episode every week.